Well, hello, everybody. Again, welcome to Syracuse University's massive open online coursework called MOOCs. Strange word to me, but I think most of you are now familiar with that phrase. And today's class, or session, if you will, is going to be about marketing and recovery marketing. And we're going to look specifically at sport organizations and how they sometimes have to deal with the concept of recovering from something that they didn't plan for. Now, let's back up. We talked in one of the previous sections about marketing and creating compelling exchange, and we know that a lot of companies like sponsoring sports activities, maybe a sports league, or maybe endorsing a famous sport athlete. But what happens when it goes wrong? What happens when that athlete maybe gets caught doing something illegal? What happens when the sporting event maybe has a terrible tragedy unfold in the middle of the event? And we can create some examples. There's certainly been a lot of deaths in auto racing over the years. The Olympics even had a death in 2010 in Vancouver when a Georgian bobsledder coming down the course just days before the Olympics opened crashed and unfortunately died during that practice run. And the Olympic movement then had to deal with the fact that they had created a course or had created an event that could potentially take somebody's life. Now, it's not a scandal per se, and we'll come back to that word, but what it does represent is the unknown, and it happened in just a blink of an eye, is suddenly something that the organization and then the sponsors and the networks all have to deal with. So what I want to ask you today is, how should a firm react when their brand's reputation is either attacked or the brand's reputation is at risk? And this is a challenge that I think it's worth students who are interested in going into sport management thinking about what exactly happens and how often does it happen. What happens when the company's brand ambassador, let's say an athlete, a star athlete, is caught in the middle of a scandal? We know that that's happened with Lance Armstrong, with Tiger Woods, any number of athletes over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, and they're suddenly at the focus of all of the media, and everyone is tweeting about it. Everyone is sending messages by way of Facebook. And if your organization, let's say it's Nike or Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Red Bull, is a sponsor of that athlete, then suddenly we might be in a situation where now the brand is going to be tarred with that same brush. So what do we do when an organization that sponsors an athlete or sponsors a sporting event is being sued or disgraced by the actions of the executives of the sports league or of the team? So what I want to do today is I want to go into a couple of topics for you to think about. And material will come up on the screen as it has in past sessions, so you'll have a chance to freeze the frame if you want and look at the information and think about, does it make sense to me? But also let's ask whether or not I can use it down the road. Will there be a moment maybe when I'm in a meeting with maybe executives or people that I report to where I'm going to have an opportunity to say, have we thought about this? A big part of this class, I guess if you want to call it that, or of this program, is making sure that the information that we give you is something that you can use maybe at a later date. And I want to be clear that it's not so much maybe about facts and memorizing facts as much as maybe an opportunity for you to think about things, maybe that you haven't thought about before, and say, can I use this, or what would I do if I were in that situation? And does this all combined help make me maybe a stronger employee or a more strategic thinker about issues that are to come? So, situations that we're going to talk about today: recovery marketing, key phrase. How do we manage a crisis? What do we do when that crisis starts to really take off? And maybe it's fueled by discussion on Facebook or on Twitter. Maybe it's fueled by the media, whether that's TV or radio or print, kind of putting this in the newspaper, magazines every day, and the organization that you maybe are with is going to have to deal with that. What can sponsors learn from things that have gone on in the past? How often does it happen? And I can tell you it happens all the time. But you may not think about it that way, and so that's a valuable part of how you start to acquire and hold on to this information. And maybe finally, what are some of the biggest scandals in sponsorship and what lessons came out of them? So up on the screen, you're going to see a slide. A lot of people are familiar with a concept that's called Successories. It's an organization that puts together posters that feature kind of inspirational comments. This was one that I found online, and this is not a successory. This is actually the opposite of it. And you can see that it says mistakes It could be that the purpose of your life is only to serve as a warning to others, and it shows a sunken boat. And so I put that up there for you to think about, because when we go into these cases where the boat has sunk, the problem's at hand, then I think we have a real opportunity to understand that these wrecks exist kind of in a lot of different places. So the NBA or the National Hockey League lock out their players and decide not to play their games. The Continental Hockey League of Russia has a plane crash that kills almost every member of a particular team. IndyCar may stage a race and a driver is killed during the competition. The Tour de France is discussed over and over again as being riddled with drugs, and that all of the winners of past years, and again, let's not talk about this kind of in a legal sense, but in terms of the generic perception that customers, that fans, that the media may have. So when I say the Tour de France has had all of their winners, of course it's not all of their winners throughout all of time, but more recently the soundbite has been all the recent winners have been thought to have been involved with performance-enhancing drugs. And so it's left the Tour de France in a situation where a lot of sponsors and a lot of media members are not completely comfortable that that organization has really gotten its hands completely around an issue that it's dealing with. In the United States, a recent issue has been the concussion issue that the National Football League has been facing. And this is a situation where it's now believed that players are sustaining concussions, and it's actually causing them to maybe commit suicide or to perhaps die far younger in real life than they might have. It's become a major issue for the National Football League, and it's one that the NFL can't and won't put its head in the sand about. It's actually going to have to deal with this in a very kind of head-forward way. That's probably the wrong cliche to use, but it's one where the NFL has got to address it, because if they don't, the media and the fans are going to take advantage of the league. So recovery marketing, let's talk about what that is, and let's give you a definition that you can work from. It entails returning a disaffected customer to satisfaction after there's been a service breakdown. And I think we've got to think of sports and entertainment in general as being a service. Now, a lot of you might not think of it that way. Sports is just something that you very much enjoy. You go to a game or you watch it on TV. But essentially the product that you're purchasing is a service provided by the organizations that maybe stage those games or those concerts that you go to. So here's a way of thinking about it, is what happens when there's a breakdown? Well, first let's talk about what is a breakdown. If I go to a game and my favorite team loses, I don't think that that's a breakdown. But if the game is interrupted by a terrible storm, or if an athlete is accidentally killed, or an athlete who's actually been a star performer in the game is actually found to be doing something illegal, there is essentially a breakdown in the service that I was expecting to be provided. And these issues are often unscripted and they're often unexpected. And that makes it really tricky for the organizers, whether it's FIFA or whether it's the English Premier League or it's the National Football League, because they don't know it's coming. They can have a sense that we may see this someday in the future, but they don't know the exact day that it's going to happen. So often these issues, when they come up, have got to be managed internally and externally. We need to tell our teams, our players, our media members what's going on. We also have to tell our fans, our sponsors, our advertisers what they can expect from us. So think of it this way, that we've got to have both internal issues and we have external issues. Another point that's really interesting is that often the greatest asset for a sport organization, let's say a star player, is also its greatest risk. So we might build our entire league or our entire team around a particular player, expecting him or her to really carry the day, to be the person that everyone wants to see. They're our greatest asset. But at the same time, if that player goes out the next night and gets arrested, or that player ultimately commits a crime, then now we're dealing with our greatest risk. The very thing we kind of hinged our promotion on, our marketing, is suddenly now something that we've got to cover up or that we've got to apologize for. And time is an interesting piece of this puzzle, and I'll talk about it as if it were a human, and so the phrase is to personify time. But time's also an abstract concept, so time can be your friend, there's that personification, or time can be your enemy. And a lot of times the way you think about time is going by really quickly, or we have enough time to do the right things to make sure we send the right messages to the right audiences. So the concept of time is pretty tricky also when you think about it being in a social and digital age. Digital means that it's going to happen immediately. The concept of digitalization, of ones and zeros, of a digital economy where anything can be shared anywhere in the world in a matter of seconds, means that as soon as someone does something bad or something unfortunate happens, that could be tweeted around the world, that could be carried by a website, it could be carried by Facebook to millions of people. And that these people are going to very quickly open something up that looks like it's juicy, that looks like it's kind of rich with drama, rich with innuendo and half-truths. And these things are not really surprising. I think a lot of us probably are very much drawn to celebrity manufacturing of a story. And so we don't know yet whether something is true or accurate, objectively reported. We just know that this story is hot and it's moving all over the world. So for organizations that have to respond to these issues, their websites have got to be very capable of actually dealing with the truth or the story that they need to get out there. And they're probably going to need to have people who are engaged by way of Facebook or by Twitter to make sure that there is a counter story to something that may be very negative, or that story is at least going to present all of the facts of a particular situation and maybe not just the most grotesque or the biggest headline type piece. Now what's interesting, and for those of you who are younger students, many executives, many people perhaps over the age of 45 are not really comfortable communicating via social networks, and they've got to therefore trust younger or more junior employees. Now, sometimes this makes it very tricky for them because they're actually trusting employees that they maybe haven't dealt with a lot to actually send messages over mediums, Twitter or Facebook, that they don't use a lot. It makes for a really interesting challenge for senior executives to make sure that they're familiar with the ways in which they can communicate in the digital age. Now, the concept of sports is a part of that, and I'm going to try not to be too abstract, but we have to make sure that we understand that in sport, let's go this way. The traditional consumer marketing model that most of us might be familiar with, of maybe buying a can of soda at a store, or maybe going into a place and buying a sandwich. The product that's actually created by the organization is controlled by the company that actually produces the product. So if you go into a store to buy a box of soap, a dishwasher detergent, the organization that made that product is actually very much in touch with the product that they created. And they design the packaging and they put it on the shelf in a way in which the product would be the same every single time. We don't get that with sport. In sport, the product changes every single time the game is played. In management, the people who actually produce the sporting activity have very little control over the team's performance, over their manager or coach, or over the specific players. The contestants, therefore, kind of control the message, and they actually control the perception of the product. And that means it can all blow up in a moment's notice. So if Tiger Woods suddenly has an infidelity issue, and that suddenly causes his sponsors to have to deal with the fact that maybe he wasn't faithful to his wife, they suddenly have something that was never scripted for them. If Michael Phelps, the great Olympic swimmer from the United States, is actually photographed holding a marijuana bong, then we've got a situation where that picture moves all over the world, and suddenly the United States Olympic Committee or USA Swimming or the IOC, the Olympics, have got to say, this representative of our sport, of our sporting culture, has suddenly put a situation together for us that we're now going to have to deal with. So I won't linger on these famous names, but these things happen sometimes very quickly, sometimes very slowly. So how often do companies design then worst case scenarios? And maybe if you work at an organization, you might want to ask that, maybe of the people that you work with, or if you think you're going to go to work for an organization and you're going to be interviewed in a job interview, is, do we have a worst case scenario plan? Do we have an understanding of, could this go wrong, and what would we do if it did? Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you that most resort hotels have plans for hurricanes. That hurricanes sometimes come through and destroy islands, and they destroy the hotels that have been set up to accommodate people going to the islands. Airlines have to be prepared for fatal crashes. These aren't popular topics to talk about, but the airlines know that there's a percentage chance that it could happen to their airline at any time. So they prepare worst case scenarios. They prepare for a situation where they've got to meet the media and talk about it. Unfortunately, in my understanding and my experience in the sports world, a lot of sports firms don't have that auxiliary plan. They don't have the ability to think about what's going to happen and what they would do. Many of you would be familiar with Coca-Cola, and at one time there was only one type of Coca-Cola, and that was it. It was Coke. But the executives in Atlanta believed that there may be a chance that they needed to bring out a new type of Coca-Cola. And so they said, we're going to cancel, let's call it old Coke, and we're going to introduce new Coke. And a lot of people didn't like the taste of new Coke, and there was a huge backlash against the organization for essentially suggesting that they were going to get rid of a great tasting brand that people really liked, and they were going to replace it with something that people immediately determined that they didn't like. One of Coke's executives, Sergio Zeman, wrote a book that was called The End of Marketing as We Know It. And in that book, he admitted, and he talked about very specifically, that it was important to admit, in Coke's case, that they were wrong, that it was a mistake and that they wanted to correct it. And then to say, we're going to be able to give you what you want. We're going to give you back the product that you really are calling for. So let's think about that now in a situation maybe with a Tiger Woods or a Lance Armstrong or a Michael Phelps or any of the athletes that you could think of who have sponsorship deals or endorsement deals, and suddenly something goes wrong. What's the essence of the problem? How's our core customer reacting to the problem? What contingency planning steps have we created in advance in case something goes wrong with our star athlete or with the team we're sponsoring? Does our contingency plan cover this particular issue, or have we maybe missed a few? You can't plan for everything, but you can certainly plan for a lot. How's our chief executive officer interacting with our public relations staff? Is there a good relationship there? Does our CEO understand that we have a PR agency or an advertising agency? Can our CEO, our chief executive officer, deal with the media? Are they willing to get out in front of an issue and say, we are prepared to deal with this immediately, we made a mistake, or a representative of our organization made a mistake? Which of our senior executives should be involved with the creation of the solution? Is that a really small group, maybe 3 or 4 of our top executives? Or should this be broadened out to maybe 10 or 15 people to make sure that we are really comprehensive in the way that we think about a problem? Are we comfortable with this negative attention, and how long can we deal with the negative attention? Can we go a day? Can we go a week? Or is this something we've got to stop right away? Is it possible we're overreacting? And a lot of you are familiar with situations where you have friends or family members who overreact and do it really well, and they get a lot of attention, but sometimes they get negative attention. They get the wrong outcome. So if we do possibly have the ability to overreact, who has the courage or the authority in our organization to suggest that? In other words, is it possible for me, if I'm a junior employee or a senior employee, to say, I think we're overreacting? I think we're not doing this in a really constrained and thoughtful way. In other words, is our situation bad, or is it really bad? And I think that begs a question that a lot of times organizations don't give themselves the luxury of stepping back to say, have we addressed this the right way? How long will negative media coverage likely run? Is this something that'll be in the media for a day or two and then gone? Is it a blip that a couple of people will read about? Or are we going to get hammered for quite a while? Is this going to be in the national media for an extended period of time? And finally, are we prepared to be honest and truthful? Are we really prepared to come out and say, this is what happened, we had no control, or this is what happened and we made a mistake? And are we willing to say we made a mistake? And this is what happened, we made a mistake, and this is what we're going to do to rectify the situation because we made a mistake. Many chief executive officers or the board of directors don't want their organization to ever admit that they've made a mistake because perhaps that's going to affect their stock price, or maybe that's going to affect someone's bonus at the end of the year. So it's interesting whether or not an organization is going to be willing to deal with that. A couple of things. A phrase that's often heard in different parts of the world is the concept of making lemonade out of lemons. Not sure if you have lemonade where you are, where you're watching this, but lemonade is kind of a sweet drink that comes from a sour fruit. And so the concept of lemonade out of lemons is, can we make this sweet tasting, or can we make this better than maybe what it was originally? And research has shown that a lot of dissatisfied clients can be retained. In other words, if there's been that service breakdown that we talked about, that people who are dissatisfied in the moment can be held onto if the right actions are taken right away. It always helps, obviously, to have created a checklist in advance of what I might do if that problem exists. Another way of saying it, there was a famous football coach in the United States named Vince Lombardi. He was the coach of the Green Bay Packers, a team that's won a number of Super Bowl championships in the National Football League. And one of the quotes that's often attributed to him was that excellence was not a part-time activity. It was an all-the-time activity. In other words, you weren't kind of good at something part of the time, and then the other times you were maybe mediocre. You had to be committed to excellence all the time. So hold on to that thought here as we come to the conclusion of this section. An action plan is really important, and I can't stress enough that I think that most organizations may not have as detailed an action plan as they want, and particularly in the sports world, where these issues that we've talked about earlier in this session happen so frequently. So it's important to understand that an action plan can allow for apologies to customers experiencing some kind of a failure. You also need to make it personal. And while that's hard for a lot of people in an age of mass media to imagine being able to say, I'm going to make this apology personal to an individual, the heartfelt sense of saying, I care about each and every fan that deals with my star athlete or my team or my league makes it really important. Let's offer a value-added solution to the problem. Let's make sure that we're not just saying sorry, but we're actually kind of adding value. So we screwed up, but to make that up to you, we're going to actually offer something to kind of show that we truly are sorry. And we're going to atone for the inconvenience maybe by offering you a risk-reducing incentive or maybe some kind of a reward. Let's say we have a horrible night at the stadium and something goes wrong. Well, maybe at the next game we want to say we're going to give everyone a free soda. And that may sound stupid at a certain level, but it's at least a way of saying to my customer, I really am sorry you had a bad time the last time you were here, and in some small way I want to make that up to you. And then the last piece is to follow up with your customers, with your fans, your consumers really, directly, and to make sure that you are talking to them in the concourses of the stadiums, or you're talking to them outside the facility where the games are played, because customers really do have memories, and they can tell if a team or a league is faking it. And I think we know that inherently in one-to-one discussions. The issue is whether or not we as a league or a team are willing to do it with our fans. Service guarantees. Is there a genuine willingness on the part of the company to reduce the offended party's problem? Are we willing to say, you really did have a problem and I really am going to address it? Does the company still have a commitment to quality as opposed to just kind of saying the things that they think people want to hear? Has the company eliminated repurchase risk for the next time? If I have a really bad experience at a stadium, aren't I going to expect that it'll be the same thing when I come back the next time? And if I do, I may not be willing to go back to the stadium. So I'm going to have to make sure that I reduce that repurchase risk, the repurchase of a ticket, by making sure that the next time it doesn't happen. So let's recap, and hopefully this has been an easy session for you to follow, and hopefully you've been able to think about maybe sporting activities that take place in your area, where you live, in your country, or on your continent, and think about maybe different places where you know things have gone really well, and they always do things the right way, and places where they've gone really poorly, and no one's ever come out and said, we got it wrong, or we're sorry, or let me make this up to you. That's our presentation for today, or our class, our MOOC, I love that word, And I want to say thanks for being with us. I'm Rick Burton. I'm the David Falk Professor of Sport Management at Syracuse University. And I look forward to our next session together. Have a great day.